1962, the world hangs in the balance as two of the mightiest superpowers threaten each other with the fear of nuclear war.
Cuba was originally a poor country struggling to keep their economy up and having to rely on the US to purchase their sugar stock. Cuba was converted into a communist country after Castro overthrew Batista, believing that he can drive the country to a better direction.
By 1961, Cuba had established a new relationship with the USSR when Castro finally became into power, since the US had backed out and stopped funding for their sugar and their capital, Havana.
Under the influence of Khrushchev, Castro changed the political system to nationalist, raising taxes for the US to pay. The USSR gained another ally in hope of spreading communism and gaining power by giving back just as many goods, such as money and other resources, to Cuba. On the other hand, the US was in favor of communism neighboring their land.
After the Cuban Revolution of 1959, the alliance of two important nations occurred. The United States and Cuba broke their treaty, and that was when the Soviet Union allied with Cuba. Cuba needed consumers for their sugar production after the US had backed off in order to sustain their economy, so they turned to the Soviet Union as well as turning into a Soviet establishment.
On October 16, 1962, John F. Kennedy found out that the Soviet Union had placed missiles in Cuba by his national security assistant, McGeorge Bundy. Bundy showed him pictures of the Soviet soldiers setting up nuclear-armed missiles.
Khrushchev decided to place Soviet missiles in Cuba because the US was ahead in the arms race and the US had placed weapons in Turkey.
John F. Kennedy put together a group called XCOM to help him decide on the action that needed to take place in order to remove the missiles. The popular vote was to invade and bomb Cuba. However, since that was proven to be unsuccessful during the Bay of Pigs, the US set a blockade around Cuba in order to prevent more nuclear weapons coming in from the Soviet Union. Kennedy also decided that if the Soviet Union did not remove their weapons within a number of days, the US would bomb Cuba.
Khrushchev had another idea. The Soviet Union would remove their nuclear weapons if the US did not invade Cuba. A few days later, he announced another proposal saying that they would remove their weapons if the US also removed their weapons from Turkey.
Kennedy completely disregarded the second proposal and added that the United Nations should oversee the removal of the weapons, and in return the US would not invade Cuba. In terms of their weapons in Turkey, the US had already decided that they were going to remove those missiles, but did not communicate that information with the Soviet Union until it was brought up.
Part of the reason as of why the conflict was resolved was because if the Soviet Union and the United States did not cooperate, the world could have been in the middle of a nuclear war.
The ideology set by the United States, the Soviet Union, and Cuba were very significant during the situation. The two superpowers had very different ideologies, therefore the conflict grew between the countries. On the other hand, Cuba and the USSR shared the same ideology once they allied with each other.
The United States ideology was set by Kennedy. He promoted liberalist life by frequently using the word freedom, since his goal was to establish more freedom and peace within the U.S. territories and worldwide, as shown in his speech to the nation concerning the Cuban Missile Crisis. Also, Kennedy doesn't agree with the communist governments of the Soviet Union and Cuba, therefore he looks down on them, so that the U.S. citizens do too. For example, Kennedy refers to the Cuban leaders as puppets and as agents of the international conspiracy.
The Soviet Union had as a goal to spread communism and expand it throughout Europe, yet they were being held back by the US, who had set their missiles in Turkey. Then, when Cuba had turned to the Soviets for help, the Soviet Union and Cuba created an alliance. So this means that they both shared the same ideology of communism. Both of them believed that Kennedy wanted to invade Cuba since it was the only communist government in the Western Hemisphere.
These different ideologies created a major conflict because the Soviet Union and Cuba thought that the US wanted to invade Cuban territories. So they decided to keep Cuba away from invasion by setting up nuclear arms pointing towards the US. These arms were placed 90 miles away from the US, which made the situation more tense and it worsened the threats.
This also made the conflict grow because then the US was receiving deadly threats and they responded in a panicking manner by bombing Cuba, which then led to severe consequences throughout America. This put Kennedy in a very difficult position since he was advised to react violently upon this situation. Kennedy's brother initially came up with the idea of bombarding Cuba, but this made Kennedy think wisely and reconsider his possibilities. Also, American citizens were not very content with Kennedy's choices, so they responded with riots and strikes.
Overall, the ideology set by both superpowers enlarged the conflict since they had very different mindsets.
Although both of these superpowers had very different ideologies that opposed each other, they finally came up with a compromise that turned away nuclear war.
As for politics and self-interest, Cuba was being attacked by the US in the Bay of Pigs, so Fidel Castro, trying to be a good leader, did not want for Cuba to feel weak. Castro thought that how they were close to the USSR, the Soviets would give Cuba some weapons to go against the US during the invasion.
The US had always favored communism, especially when Cuba was right beside them and they just became a new communist country. The US had always feared of communism taking over their country. Pearl Harbor was a huge trigger to this, since the Japanese bombed the US. Ever since then, the US had been more cautious and aware of other countries.
Cuba was lacking in natural resources, mostly weapons, which means that they were in desperate need of them. So the Soviet Union found this as a great opportunity to get closer to a country near the US, so they came to aid Cuba and they became allies. Later on, the USSR gave Cuba weapons so they could defend themselves, especially during the Bay of Pigs invasion, which unfortunately cost Cuba greatly.
Kennedy during this time was pressured by his brother Bobby Kennedy to actually bomb Cuba. However, Kennedy opposed to this idea and believed that violence was not the solution to this situation.
The role of the individual was very significant during this crisis. The most important individuals were John F. Kennedy, President of the United States, Nikita Khrushchev, leader of the Soviet Union, and Fidel Castro, leader of Cuba.
John F. Kennedy was significant since he decided what to do about the missiles. To help him decide, Kennedy put together a group called the XCOM. The majority of the XCOM members wanted to bomb Cuba, but Kennedy decided not to due to the infamous Bay of Pigs incident, and because dropping a nuclear bomb could possibly result in a nuclear war. Kennedy decided to put a blockade around Cuba in order to prevent new weapons from the Soviet Union from entering.
Kennedy also believed that Cuba was going to jeopardize the opportunities that the US had in Latin America because they had turned to communism and therefore were no longer in the Western sphere of influence.
Nikita Khrushchev was the most competitive in this situation.
Okay, yes, that's true. He decided to place missiles in Cuba to increase his nation's nuclear strike capability. He felt threatened by the amount of missiles in Turkey and Western Europe that were there because of the US, and so he decided that placing missiles in Cuba was leveling the playing field.
Khrushchev also had a strong quid pro quo personality. This is demonstrated during the crisis on October 26th to 27th of 1962, where he was willing to remove the missiles from Cuba in return for a promise not to invade Cuba. He then adjusted his proposal by promising a removal of the missiles if the US removed the weapons from Turkey.
Finally, on to the last major individual involved in the crisis, Fidel Castro, leader of Cuba. Castro became the leader of Cuba after the Civil War in January 1960.
At this time, Cuba was supplying the US with their sugar stock. However, when Fidel Castro came to power, he nationalized the companies that produced the sugar in order to control the production, as well as believing this would be more beneficial to the working and lower class of Cuba.
The US was discontented because of the change in the Cuban companies. Castro nationalized sugar companies, which infuriated the Americans because they felt that Cuba should not benefit all the low social classes, and they should be more focused on supplying the US with sugars.
This left Cuba turning to the USSR. Since Cuba's leader was now following a communist ideology, the USSR was more than happy to form a Cuban-Soviet relationship, with Russia now buying their sugar as well as selling oil below world prices.
The Soviet Union was more than glad to help Cuba because they wanted to have an alliance with someone near the US, and they were the first Latin American country for the Soviets to reach out. Cuba had provided sugar and their land as a missile base in return, just so they could create a powerful alliance.
Cuba was now fully relying on the USSR, since their sugar industry was once again boosting their economy. Soon the Soviets had Castro change the economy and political system. Because of this, Cuba became fully Marxist and Leninist. For urban development, Cuba was originally lacking resources and had a poor economy. Cuba had also unfortunately endured an attack from the US, with Kennedy attempting to overthrow Castro, wiping out a huge amount of land.
America managed to give Cuba money in return of sugar. However, when Castro converted the companies to nationalists, the economy dropped. Castro believed that America was indeed benefiting Cuba. However, it wasn't benefiting all the citizens. 3% was covered by a harmful weed. 18% was used for roads, buildings, and other exposed lands. 0.3% was inactive or uncultivated farms. There were about 160,000 farms with the average of 56.7 hectares. During the 1950s, sugar was Cuba's dominant source.
It even plays as a greater part today than it did before.
The missiles placed in Cuba was also a drastic change because they were pointed to the USA. Not only did this put the US in a difficult position, but Cuba as well. With Castro agreeing to obtain the missiles secretly, the Cubans were infuriated once they found out.
Cuba had been sent 2 missile launchers, jet-led bombers with 1 assembled along with 2 more. Jet fighters had 35 weapons assembled and another 62 weaker ones, as well as 16 missile launch sites for missiles.
From this video you can tell all 5 keys were important contributors to the event, and some may be more important than others. Natural resources was basically what began the conflict between Cuba and the United States, as Castro wanted to change the sugar supply system and the government in Cuba. However, Cuba relied on both the United States and the Soviet Union for the growth in their economy and to gain more connections for trading.
This can also be said for urban development, as Cuba's economy heavily relied on sugar, and that's what caused them to have relations with other countries. However, politics and self-interest is what caused the conflicts, as each nation was acting in their own interest in the crisis and throughout the whole of the Cold War.
Well, yes, because Castro allied with the Soviet Union as it benefited him as well as the Soviets, as they were able to place their missiles next to their enemy.
Also, politically, the US did not want a communist country in their sphere of influence, but because Cuba and the Soviet Union were joining forces, they were spreading communism and gaining economic power.
That also connects to ideology, as it's what the leaders stood by. Kennedy was focused on spreading the liberal, or American, way of life throughout his sphere of influence and around the world. But because Kennedy and Castro were promoting a completely different way of life, conflict arose between the 3 leaders. Speaking of leaders, the role of the individual was extremely important in this event, as the leaders were the ones who made the final decisions in terms of how to react.
For example, in Kennedy's case, he put together XCOM, and even though most of the members in the group voted in favor for invading and bombing Cuba, he decided not to.
I think role of individual was most important during the crisis because of that.
The world was at the brink of nuclear war because of the clash of the different ideologies from both parties.
If no solution had been found, the world would have probably ended in a nuclear war. Yet due to the fact that Khrushchev and Kennedy didn't want this to happen, they cooperated since they came to an agreement.
We can connect this to today, since there are cooperations between states to develop non-proliferation treaties.
We can say states are better cooperating nowadays in order to prevent a nuclear war, as Kennedy and Khrushchev did.